I welcome you to this chapter, and this chapter we're going to be looking at firewall user management. And I just want to pause and throw this question to you. What comes to your mind when you hear the word user management? Anyone? Say mic check and go ahead and speak to us.
Mic check.
Yes, Romeo?
I understand user management as a way of controlling people who can have access to certain system or some resource.
Okay, controlling users to a certain system or some resource. Okay, I think Romeo has said it. So we're going to be looking at how can we be able to control the users and manage these users who have access to our firewall, or users who are going to be accessing our resources using or being controlled by the firewall. So upon completion of this course, you'll be able to understand the AAA technologies. You'll be able to understand authentication technologies, and also the user authentication management configurations. Those with some brief backgrounds, what do you think the AAA stand for?
Mic check.
Go ahead, Richard.
It is authentication, accounting, and authorization.
Authentication, authorization, and accounting. And we want to be understanding. What do you think authorization stands for?
Mic check.
Yes, Agaba?
Yes. Authorization stands for permitting someone to access or be in position of acquiring some information.
Okay, Agaba says permitting someone to access something. Anyone with a divergent view? Okay, what comes to your mind when you hear the word authorization?
Mic check.
Go ahead.
Just on authentication, when we talk about authentication, we simply refer to identifying someone or a user who's trying to access a particular resource on a system. So we're simply identifying someone when we try to authenticate.
Okay, we are looking at
check.
Yes, please.
Authentication, to my understanding, is the credentials or the details that are used to identify a user on a system, and authorization is after that the details have been matched and they are correct, then you are authorized to access a system. So authentication in this case can be like the password, the thumbprints, and then authorization is the process of letting the person access.
Okay, giving someone the permission to access. And how about accounting?
Mic check.
Go ahead.
I think, okay, let me start on authentication. Authentication, I think we want to certify that is it the real person or
Mic check.
yes, certifying, and then authorization that's giving permission, and accounting. On accounting, I think we are referring to is the person that we have given the permission to access the resources,
Mic
the
check.
network resources, actually accessing those resources.
Okay, thank you. We are trying to account and monitor what the user is using. Yes, someone is saying mic check.
Yes, mic check.
I think authentication is basically verification and validation.
Okay.
Mic check.
Verification and validation. Yes, please.
Mic check.
Yes, please.
I think
Chulu, your network is failing you, but thank you all. You had very interesting views. So we want to be looking at some of these things in this chapter and understand what they are in detail. Chulu, allow me to cut you short. Your network is not enabling us to hear what you want to contribute, and it is breaking. So Let us try and move forward. So we want to use that user authentication and the AAA technical principles. They are common on almost all devices. They rely on this kind of network. So as the number of attacks come into play and they come to play, and different users are not prone to attacks. People are finding out how best they can be able to compromise your packets and play with those packets and be able to either interrupt your information and be able to take your data. Enterprises want the capability to precisely identify users, to know who is on our network, and ensuring that legitimate applications operate normally, and also block applications that may bring security risks. And using the traditional way of blocking IP addresses and ports and what are no longer sufficient, or they are no longer enough means of making sure that you can easily distinguish users and applications in the network. Traditional access policies based on the quintuples, like we have been looking at it, cannot adapt to some of the changes in the current network environment. That's why on top of them, you also need to come up with different ways of making sure you authenticate the users on your network, you authorize those users, and you also account. We gave you permission to do ABCD. What have you done? For how long have you done that? And were you, and you are able to tell basing on those reports. So we have so many threats like, data leaks causes significant economic losses, irrelevant activities that decrease working efficiency. Someone's supposed to be at work, they are busy playing games, or they're busy on Twitter or on WhatsApp. And you, as a security engineer, you need to make sure that you have put in place mechanism to make sure that you mitigate all some of these risks, like the web attacks, illegitimate behavior, damage groups, and irrelevant applications that may consume bandwidth. People are trying to access emails. Someone is busy downloading things on Telegram, and people are unable to send and receive emails at the same time. So we want to look at AAA, and we want to understand what some of those things do. Like you have told me, it refers to authentication, authorization, and accounting, and some of the principle which is commonly used on almost all networking devices, and also some of the systems we access to date. So when accessing the internet, a user, for example, in this example, we need to be able to access the internet. So this particular user here, let's say it's Abraham. Patrick here wants to access the internet. So Abraham needs to enter a username and password for authentication on his connection where he is, or at his workplace. I want to ask him for the username and password to be able to communicate to or connect to the internet. That is authentication. Maybe on your router, you go to your Wi-Fi device, they ask you, oh, you want to communicate to this, put in your username all and password for you to be able to communicate. So he'll go ahead and put in those username details, and they were going to verify his identity on the system, and they say, okay, that is Abraham. But after authentication also, now we have some kind of firewall or security device which is going to authorize the user or grant permission to access different resources, such as let's say Google or Bing here for searching, or maybe even WhatsApp or even other platforms like Facebook. And I'll use an example here of Facebook here in Uganda. So after authorizing, now Airtel, MTN will go ahead and look through your details. Okay, this guy, has he paid OTT? If he has paid OTT, we authorize him to go ahead and also access social media. Here in Uganda, you can't access social media apart from the new law which has just been passed with this budget, and they are going to just increase on the tariff on data on internet, but they're going to scrap off the social media tax. So they'll check, did he pay the tax? If they didn't pay the tax, they are not authorized to access WhatsApp and Facebook. If they paid the tax, then they are authorized to go ahead and access some of those social media platforms. Now, that is that. Now, we go to another stage after being given permission to do that. So during the time when Abraham is accessing those resources, he's busy on, let's say, WhatsApp, downloading and sending pictures and videos that have been sent to him, and he's using MBs here. So Airtel and MTN starts accounting for the number. Oh, he has now used 10 MBs. He has now used, okay, 20 MBs. So they are now accounting, or the counting is performed to record the user's operations and also online duration. They have connected, they've been online. The OTT expires after 24 hours. Now they're going to start accounting. He has started, he paid that time. Now he's left with, let's say, 6 hours. And now he has so far downloaded 20 MBs, 40 MBs, depending, and then etc, so on and so forth. So they are going to do the authentication, authorization, and accounting. So let us look at authentication. Like many of you have told me, it basically refers to the confirmation of user identities using various kind of factors. We can use factors like what I know. This includes information that the user knows. As you're going to know your password, you're going to know your PIN. These are things that you know, or even the reset, password reset questions, security questions that will be asked you. Which state were you born? What is your first SMIBT? Those different questions that will be asked to you. This is what is known to you. Things like the password, things like the PIN, or that, the different tokens that you have. These are things that are going to be known to you as an individual. Then there are things that you have, like our colleagues told us, what you have on you. It could be a smart card, which you're going to go and use. It could be a USB, authentication device. It could be your ID at your workplace. Whenever you have to access that different premise, you go ahead and swipe it, and then it allows you to clock in and also clock out. Your ATM card, if you don't have it, you won't be able to access your resources. So what you have, you go into your ATM machine and then swipe in your ATM card, and then also use what you know, like the PIN, to be able to be authenticated, to verify your identity, to be authenticated to actually access your money. And then there are also some other ways, like what you are, like who you are. These are unique biometric features that a user has, like a fingerprint, like your iris, something which is going to read your device, like your voice, DNA, etc, etc. And this is authentication, basically confirming confirmation of the user's identities in various kinds of factors. So authorization, basically we are authorizing or authorizes users to access certain services, including public services and sensitive services. Authorized users use certain commands to device management, and this will give you an example. For example, we can access them to access resources, or we can even access them to use some kind of commands on our network that this particular user can add. This particular user can only view, or this particular users can only edit, right? They can view, but they cannot be able to go ahead and edit, or even delete, or add, or depending on what you want to achieve. Those are the different commands that they can do. But they can access, let's say, this file, but they can just view it, or they can, do whatever depending on the available commands you have set. In this example, we have the level of guest, employee, and manager. As you can see, the guest here, he has access to the resources that you have made public, right? Let's say about the company, what those things that you want any guest to access. And then the employee here, he has access to some kind of common, services, like let's say the records, it's going to prepare the payroll, and those different kind of level common services that an employee would need. And then the manager now has access to sensitive kind of services in the system. They can be able to you add an employee, or even remove an employee, or add a table, depending on what you want to achieve as an organization. So that is authorization. The other one is accounting, and you have already told me this one. We are looking at how long the user use a service. We have given them permission to go ahead and do that, but for how long have they been using that service? How much did the user spend on using that network? How much, but with the metrics, the things that they have used on the network, and what have the user done during that time? When they have been on the network, what did they withdraw money? Did they deposit money? Did they transfer funds? Or did they delete a user? Did they add a new user? And here we're able to come up with an audit trail to be able to, count for the resources or the user resources of our system resources. So basically, to use the AAA technologies, we can have quite a number of authentication mechanisms, and one of those ways is no authentication. And with no authentication, here is performed on trusted users. But in most of cases today, this type of authentication is not recommended. Please do not use no authentication. Even if it is trusted user, even if it is you who is accessing your router at home, please do not remove authentication. You need to verify also your identity, because someone, if there's no authentication and they're able to tap onto your network, then they're able to tap and manipulate some of your resources. So this kind of authentication is not, in most cases, advisable. So we have local authentication, and with local authentication here, it configures user information, including the username, password, attributes of local users on a network access server. And then local authentication offers fast processing and low operation costs. But also the capacity of user information is limited by hardware. So what happens here, you have your network access server, which you're going to store all your username and all the authentication is going to happen locally on your local device. So your local device stores, it's going to act as your network access server, and it's going to store all, the usernames and password. And whenever someone has to be, authenticated, they just directly go ahead and go through the firewall. It will check the username and the password, and then it will give authentication to the user. We also now have the server authentication, and with the server authentication, what it does, there's a third-party kind of device, and it configures user information, including username, password, and other attributes on a third-party authentication server. You have a third-party, you have a server put on your network dedicated to perform your authentication services for you. So AAA can remotely authenticate users through a remote authentication dial-in user service, which is very common, the Radius. And of course, there are also other technologies like the Huawei Terminal Access Control Access System and Control Access System. And this kind of protocol can also be used on Huawei, or you can even use the Radius server. There are some of the common third-party authentication servers or protocols that you can be able to use. So these are two ways. We have local authentication, we have server authentication. So let us look at the Radius.
Mic check.
Yes, please.
In the instance when we are asked the different types of authentication, what if I list no authentication? Is it one of them, or it will be a no?
It is one of them. It is a type of authentication, though it is not recommended. But it's one of them. You can choose and configure no authentication on your firewall.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So let us look at the Radius, which we called the remote authentication dial-in service protocol, which we are calling the Radius. So the remote access dial-in user service protocol sets up a unique database to store user names and passwords for authenticating users. You have your user, they're going to send your username and password, and the firewall is just going to forward the request to the Radius server to check, is this user permitted, and the username, and then the Radius server respond, oh, okay, either they are permitted or not, and then it will go ahead and perform the desired kind of process. So Radius is one of the most common protocols used to implement AAA. It is widely applied to the network access server system, and it defines how a user authentication and accounting information and results are transmitted between the network access server and the Radius server. So the network access server transfers user authentication and accounting information, that is the username and the password that the user has put in to the Radius server. So the Radius server receives the connection requests from our network access server. In this case, we're talking about, it could be a firewall, any device that is capable of doing that. After receiving that connection requests from users, authenticates the user and then returns authenticated results to the network access device, in our case, our firewall. So the Radius uses the user datagram protocol, the UDP, as a transport layer to provide excellent real-time performance And also it supports retransmission mechanism and backup server mechanism to ensure high availability. So the process is that the process of, yes, please.
Now, I'm trying to understand. I'm sorry if I'm taking you back, but in this case where we are talking about radius, does Sophos, Firewall, or CyberROM fall also under this? Because in Sophos, you can configure users and save them, and then without Sophos, a user cannot access a different database. In this case, Sophos is not in that user PC, it is a firewall which has the databases, or you can even choose to use a centralized system. So does it fall under this, or it falls in a different class? Sophos and CyberROM as
well. If that is entirely going to depend. If you are using Sophos as a remote kind of server, and it's not the one that is performing the control, the network access control system, it's not the one that is going to perform, to perform, protecting the network, to check our packets, the data flow. It's not the one performing that duty. Then it is basically a device that you have, implanted on your network to perform authentication duties. Then it will fall under this category. But if it is the same device, like it's your same firewall that you are using to control traffic on your network, to either deny packets, allow packets, and also it's the same device that is creating databases for authentication purposes of users even on other networks, then this one will not be falling under this category. It will not be falling under server authentication, but rather under local authentication. Because local, why? Because it's the same firewall which is performing the data control, the data flow control, right? Checking the packets, allowing, denying, deleting, and doing all that. But if there is another server, a third-party authentication server, that's going to store the usernames and passwords. And whenever your network access device, let's say your firewall, so forth, wants to check and see if this user is accessing or allowed, it will send the packets first to this remote server or the third-party server, and then this one will perform the authentication, and then it will return the results to the network access server. And once this guy checks that this user is performed, then he'll go ahead and let this user go ahead and access the different resources. I don't know if I've answered you correctly, but basically that is it. You're welcome. So we are saying that the Radius server sets up a unique database to store usernames and password for authenticating users. And we have our network access server. This one is performing our data flow control, and it's going to be able, but when it comes to authentication and the user wants to access a particular given system, it's going to go ahead and access the Radius server, tells Radius, hey, there's this guy with username and password, he wants to access a service. Is he authenticated? This guy is going to check his DB and see, okay, it matches and it correlates. Okay, yes, he's permitted to access, and the firewall will go ahead and allow the user to access the different resources. So we are talking about the firewall, and we're looking at the process. So the Radius on the network receives the username and the password and sends it to sends the authentication request to the Radius server. And if the request is valid, then the server is going to complete the authentication and sends the required authorization information to the client. And if the request is invalid, the server is going to send the authentication failure and information to the client. Usually, our Radius has this different information, our Radius message structure. We have our code, we have our identifier, we have the length, and also the attribute. The code here basically refers to the message type, such as access request. Is it a response request, or is it, that kind of type, all access permit, or deny. So, and then the identifier refers to a string of numbers used to identify a message, because sequential messages use an incremental identifier. A request and a reply must contain the same identifier. I've sent in a request and a reply or a response, they must have the same identifier. we have the length, and the length refers to the total length of all fields within that packet, that radius message structure packet. And then the attribute. The attribute comprises the main content of the message and is a user specific, depending on who is sending it. And then the authenticator is used to authenticate the reply from the radius server. So that is the structure of that message. So the scenario is that we have how you can apply it. You have your network access system here or your firewall here that is controlling all your data, and the user wants to access a given resource. So when the user wants to access a given resource, then user will enter his username and password at the same time, and then the access request will be sent to the radius server. And the access request basically indicates the authentication request process, that I am the user, I want to access ABCD, and then the access accept is sent back, and it indicates the authentication response process basically. And then after that is done and it has been, successful, then it's going to go ahead and send the accounting requests to start, because it needs to know that this user is going to be accessing for this, details for this time and for that time. And if not successful, then instead of the access accept, it will be reject if the user does not have all that information on the server, and it indicates the reject process. And then if they have been successful and the accounting request starts, then the radius server will respond and says it indicates the accounting process has started, and then the user now at that particular point can be able to access the resources that they wanted to acquire. Once they are done, still the network access system will go ahead and send the request to stop, and then the response will, the radius server will respond, and then there will be a notification to end access of the different resources that are used on our system. So we have the Huawei terminal access controller access control system, what we are calling, it has so many letters, the HWTACACS, Huawei terminal access controller access control system. It's an enhancement of the terminal access controller access control system, similar to Radius. It works like Radius. And this Huawei terminal access controller access control system uses the client server model to implement communications between our network access system, like the firewall, and our terminal access control system. access terminal, sorry, the terminal access controller access control system, and the servers that are put in place to perform the authentication. So the typical application of the HWTACACS is open to perform authentication, authorization, and accounting for a user logging into a device. The device functions as the HWTACS client to send the username and password to the Huawei terminal access controller access control system server for authentication. And if a user is authenticated and authorized, then the user can log into the device to perform operations. It basically also similarly works like our Radius server we have just seen, but only this one is just for Huawei. What happens is that when the user tries to log in, it gives them authentication to start, right? And the user logs in, sends the details, then this server is asking for authentication to start. So the user responds to the message and requests the username. Okay, there's a user here who wants to be authenticated in our system to start. In the initial state, here the user does not send the username or the password. As you can, what it sends an authentication to start, and then the server will respond, please enter the username. Then you have seen those prompts. Then the username receives this request, enter username. Then the user will enter the username, and then it will be sent authentication control message and sent a username to the server, and then the authentication response comes back. Okay, please now enter a password. And then they'll enter the password, and then the password is entered by the user, and authentication persistent message, because now it's a persistent message, it's continuous, and then it will bring a password to the server, and then After that, the authentication response, authentication is passed. If it is failed, then the packets are discarded. If it's passed, then the firewall now says, okay, since my client has passed the authentication, please, we are initiating our authorization request, and then the authorization response, authorization passed, then the user successfully logs in and accesses the different resources on the network.
So Sandy, is this the same as, for example, what Google uses when you're logging into Gmail? Those days it used to ask for the username and password at the same time, but this time when you place login, that is when it's asked for the username. You continue to ask for the password.
Yes. Perfect example. Something similar to that. First, place in your username, goes to the server, checks your details, and see if you're there. It provides a higher level of security. And then after checking the device, then after putting in your username, it will ask you again, please put in your password. And then it will send the details. And then after it does the authentication, then you are able to log in and access the resources. So comparison between the Huawei terminal access control system and Radius is that Huawei access control system uses TCP, three-way handshake, whereas Radius uses UDP. The authentication and authorization port are either 1812, all 1813 or 1645 and 1646 respectively. Encryption, when it comes to encryption, the device encrypts a packet except its Huawei access terminal, Huawei terminal access control system header. So basically the entire packet you're sending is encrypted. As you can see, there's more data security. Whereas here at Radius, the device encrypts only the password field. So the username is not encrypted. And in case someone intercepts that packet, they can be able to know the username and then start from there performing the brute force password cracking. Authentication and authorization. Here, authentication and authorization are separate. They first identify you on the system, and after then authentication and authorization is also done separately. Whereas here, authentication and authorization are implemented together. As you can see, this one offers better security. Application applies to security control. Here, basically focus on accounting, who is accessing what and for how long they're accessing the resources. Configuration commands, it supports the authorization of configuration commands, does not support the authorization of configuration commands. Those are some of the differences. So let us look at another protocol, which we are calling the lightweight directory access protocol, the LDAP. It was developed from the X500 directory access protocol, and it organizes objects hierarchically into a tree structure. You have your tree, your root, then you have the different things connected to that, and then you can have other children from those different tree structure kind of something. So this X500 directory service implements identity authentication and access control, and LDP, or the lightweight directory access protocol, simplifies the directory of X500 and meets internet requirements. So the directory service is basically a system consisting of a directory, database, and set of access protocols. So information that can be stored is maybe information about an enterprise, an employee, for example, the name, email address, you can store all those things in that kind of directory database. Physical information of a device, also like IP address, vendor, when it was purchased, also can be also stored, and also public certificate and security key. The features, you have data is organized in a directory mode. There's a unique access point is provided for external users. Data is stored in a distributed mode, and data query is optimized for fast read operations. So this is a lightweight directory access protocol. So in the lightweight directory access protocol, information is organized in a tree structure, like you've just in the previous picture, and the basic unit, the basic data unit is an entry. And each entry consists of multiple attributes, and attributes consists of a type of one or more values. So the directory information tree is a collection of all directories in an entry. And an entry is a node in a directory entries tree and consists of series of attributes, whereas an attribute describes features of an object. It consists of attribute type and one or more attribute values. We have the RDN, the relative distinguished name. It is a unique or it uniquely identifies child entries of an entry. And the distinguished name that uniquely identifies an entry in a directory. So where there's RDN, child, DN, an entry. Okay, so I think those are some of the things. So the link lightweight directory access protocol authentication process. Here, a user enters the username and password to initiate the login requests, and the firewall is going to establish a TCP connection with the lightweight directory access protocol server. And then after initiating, it's going to bind the request, and then it's going to send a bind reply. And then this bind is carrying the administrator DNN and the password to the link to the lightweight directory access protocol server. So this message is just to obtain the query permission. After that is done, the server then returns a binding reply to our firewall here, and after it returning the binding reply message, it will now, the firewall uses the username entered by the user to send a user a search request message to the server. So it's going to use the username that the user has provided to the server. Please help me do a directory name access. Remember, this uniquely identifies an entry in the database. So it will go ahead and say, help me search for this user request in the database. Kindly help me search. And then you will search, and then you will give a response. Once it's, once the details are there, it's going to bind the request to this particular request, and then it will send a bind reply, and then it will also send the, ask for the password, and then the user enters the password, and then the LDP server will check whether the password is correct, and if it is correct, then it will send a binding response, and then authorization will begin matching the details, and then the user successfully logs in. So this one bases on a lightweight directory kind of database, which is stored on that server. So we have user authentication classification. The AAA technology provides user authentication methods like local authentication, server authentication, single sign-on, message authentication. Many of you have seen and used some of these authentications later on, but let us try and now look at local authentication. With local authentication, a user sends a username and password that identify the user to the firewall through portal authentication page. You have your captive portal, some kind of authentication page from the firewall, and the firewall, in this case, stores and performs the authentication. This method is called local authentication because it's our device, our firewall device, which is performing our data control, which is now performing also the authentication. That's why it's called local. Remember, I also looked at local the other side. We looked at local and server. So when it comes to server authentication, still we have also looked at it and it makes sense to you. Here we say the user sends a username and password that identify the user to the firewall, but through a captive authentication page. So once the firewall receives the details, it's not the one which is going to perform the authentication, right? And it doesn't even store the password, but instead the firewall sends the username and password to a third-party authentication server like the Radius, the Huawei terminal access control system, or like the lightweight directory protocol access protocol for authentication, right? To perform the authentication. This method is called server authentication. So here it's going to send to a third party kind of server to help it perform the authentication. We have also single sign-on. Some of you have used it. Here what happens, the user sends the username and password, and after sending the username and password to the firewall, that identify the user to a third-party authentication server like our Radius, Then after the user passes authentication, the third-party authentication server sends the user's identity and information to the firewall. And the firewall only records the user's identity information but does not perform authentication. This process is called a single sign-on. So after the first sign-on, the firewall will go ahead and send your details to a third-party server for authentication. Then after, when it is replied, the server will go ahead and store that information. Next time you're given permission to access, but it's not the one which has done the authentication. The third party server has done the authentication, but this is what you're calling single sign-on. And then we have SMS authentication. Many of you who use bank systems have used this, and some applications like WhatsApp, for you to be able to access their services, you also need to do SMS authentication. They send you an SMS on your phone and you're authenticated to use their services. So a user accesses the portal authentication. Even Huawei.
Huawei platform.
Okay. Yes. So some of those users have that. So here, the user accesses the portal authentication page and requests for an SMS verification. They ask you, okay, put there your number. You put there your number, and then authentication. After it succeeds, the user enters the correct verification code, which is sent to them. This process is called SMS authentication. They'll send you a code on your phone, and then you go ahead and put in the code, and then after there, you authorized or you authenticated to use the services. Those are the three methods of a AAA authentication. So we want to look at user management and application scenarios. Let us look at organizational structure and classification of users. How are users structured in an organization, and how are users classified in organizations? So user management, users are allocated to different groups usually, even under normal circumstances. Even in our organizations to date, users are allocated to different departments. You have users in, let's say, administrators or management. You have, let's say, marketing department. You group them into different groups, and they are authenticated and labeled and assigned with different permissions and applications for the purpose of security. Okay, you have your super users, they can access your databases and everything, but your HR, or let's say someone at the reception, has different kind of permissions, and for this is done purposely for security. Imagine if the receptionist has access to your core database, that is a problem, right? So even in our organizations today, users are grouped, and even their network behavior, they can access some things. Even audits can be performed and policies can be customized using a graphical user interfaces on most of the firewalls today. So you can even generate reports. They are presented to user information to know this particular user has used 5 GB in a day. We don't know how and all the resources that we're accessing. So we need to probably look into it, do the analysis, tracing and auditing user behavior instead of basically auditing IP addresses, which can be even dynamic if you're using DHCP. So this facilitates policy-based information behavior control in scenarios where users' IP addresses frequently change. So you can be able to know this user is accessing things that these are the key applications. We can give them the first priority of bandwidth. These are prohibited applications. The traffic we should block, let's say like pornographic sites or ad sites or sites that are dangerous to the organization. And then you can be able to know that this particular user group is allowed to either access or is not allowed to access ABCD. And you can be able to know that this particular user, based on user management, has accessed ABCD or has tried to access ABCD, which is contrary with what you accept them to access on your network. So they are breaching the protocol, and therefore you must be aware and you must do something about it. And in case things like viruses or coming from other kinds of sites, you can choose to block them and you choose to block the traffic. So you can use that kind of mechanism. So a firewall also in this regard.
Check.
Yes, please.
Is two-factor authentication also considered under SMS authentication?
It depends on the method it is using for authentication. If it's sending you SMS, then it is considered to be that. Sometimes
normally like Gmail uses SMS.
Yes. Then that is two-factor authentication. But also Gmail sometimes uses email, or they have even bettered their kind of systems. And if you have your phone and it's connected, you just see a sign-on pop up, and you select a number you see on your screen, and then you access your sites. Or some of them even they send you an email on another
device.
email.
Known device.
Yes. Alternative email which you selected, but all use the same mechanism of SMS authentication.
All right.
For better security. So the organizational structure involves three concepts. One, you have the authentication domain, and with the authentication domain, it is a container of organizational structure, like the top level domain, the authentication domain. Similar to the Microsoft Active Directory service, the firewall provides a default authentication domain and supports additional users created authentication domain. So you can go ahead and create your other user authenticated domain, but it also provides you with a default authentication domain. So similar to horizontal groups, users can be in an enterprise, use either third-party authentication servers to store organizational structures for policies based on cross-development security group security created on a firewall, and they must be consistent with organizational structure on authentication service. So you can have your AD server, your Active Directory, which is going to be performing your authentications, and you can have a user or user group, and users and departments to which they belong are basic units of an enterprise. And an administrator can divide users into user groups, right, based on their departments to form a tree-shaped kind of organizational structure for the intranet. This commonly used structures facilitates lookup and location of users and user groups. So security group, a user group is a cross-department group in a horizontal organizational structure, and user groups enable you to manage users in dimensions other than just that by department. You can create a group between multiple departments, and you say particular for all these departments, marketing, registration and distribution, and HR are all part of this user security group, and all these guys cannot access, let's say, YouTube. And then you say managers and CEOs from those different departments are part of the security groups, and they can access maybe your core banking services. So depending on entirely what you want to achieve as a security engineer. So organizational structure management, the system has a default authentication domain, and each user group can contain multiple users and user groups. Each group belongs to only one parent user group, and each user can belong to at least one user group, at least one, or even more. So like you can see here, we have our top level authentication default domain. We have our different departments. We have marketing. You have created your registration and distribution, and even visitor or guests, groups. But under registration and this department, you have department 1 and department 2, and under here you have employee 1, employee B, employee C, and employee D. But employee C and D belong to department 2, and employee A and B depend to department 1. And you can have a cross-departmental group, and this group can now combine this employee and this employee and this employee, much as this guy is coming from a different department, basically to help us, depending on the different kind of policies you want to apply to them. So the firewall identifies authentication domains container in names and also assigns users the required authentication to correspond authentication domains. The firewall also authenticates users based on their authentication domain configurations. What's the time? Domain configurations. Wow, we're running out of time. So the classification of users, we can have administrator, we have internet user, and remote user. Administrator, this is a person, or an administrator is a user who accesses devices like administrator level, like through telnet, SSH, web, FTP, or even the console port, and configures and operates the devices on the network. Your internet user, like you hear the word internet user, they are users on your intranet entity that access the internet resources. Like maybe you in your organization and accessing the internet resources, you also classified as an internet user. The remote user are those users who use technologies like VPNs to remotely access the intranet entity or resources. It's from remotely, like they are in a different location and they access your resources, like you're at home, but you're accessing the resources at your company, maybe through a secure socket layer VPN, or we're going to look at these things in chapter 4, L2TP VPN, IPsec tunnel, or the VPN or PPPO over Ethernet. So we are going to look at some of these things in detail later on, but basically they need to connect through such resources before accessing network resources at your headquarters for maximum security. So we have looked at the internet users, we have looked at the administrator users and the remote users. So let us now try and look at the administrator authentication process and configuration. The administrator can access our firewall on our network devices through either the console port. The firewall has a port behind the console port where they can put the cable and directly connect to it, or through telnet, or through SSH or FTP, or even the web, like you have seen, where we have been mostly accessing our firewall through the web. Those are some of the different ways you can access your firewall through that. Device management, if you want to be able to add administrator, you can go to your web, go add your system administrator and click add to create administrator client. You give the administrator name and set the device management type to console, telnet, or FTP. And then you set IP addresses, blah, blah, blah. Basically, this is how you can create an administrator who can be able to access, apart from the default one where we say the username is admin and the default password is admin at 123. So device management using SSH, still you can go ahead and create a client, but instead of this time around, you select local authentication here, but instead of selecting other things, you make sure that you enable the that's telnet service on either IPv4 or STP service. You also make sure that you enable them, so that you need to keep the SSH option available to you. So you go ahead and select here in types, select SSH, because they're going to be connecting using via SSH. Go to your web GUI. If you want to connect via web management, select, give the administrator role, and then select the password that user will be using, and then you select web. Instead of selecting telnet here, you go ahead and select and tick web. After ticking web, you go ahead and enable HTTP services, because you need that packets, because how will the user access HTTP protocol when you have not enabled the services to go through the firewall? So you enable them, and then you go ahead and give permission to those users. So authentication process for internet access users and remote access users. Remember, internet users are those users who access your internet, and remote users who access your internet or extranet resources from remotely. So let us look at the process. Basically, this is the process. They can either use, Active Directory single sign-on, or the Agile Controller single sign-on, or they can use so many other mechanisms. They are quite detailed, but we shall try and go through some of those things very, very fast. So when it comes to single sign-on of internet users are authenticated by other authentication systems, and they do not need to be authenticated again by the firewall. The firewall can obtain information linking to the authenticated users to their IP addresses to implement user-specific policy management. This method applies to scenarios where the authentication system has been deployed before user authentication is deployed on a server. So we can use Active Directory single sign-on. We can use you can use the TSM single sign-on. A user is authenticated by the Huawei TSM policy, or you can use a Radius single sign-on, where the user accesses the NAS, which forwards the user information authenticated request to the Radius server. So we have a built-in authentication for the internet access users. The firewall provides a built-in portal authentication page, and that authentication page it has a default IP address, and then the port, which is 887, which is going to help authenticate users. And to authenticate users, the firewall forwards authentication requests to the local user access authentication server, This method applies to scenarios where the firewall authenticates users. So it can redirect authentication or use user-initiated authentication. So we have also user-defined portal authentication, and the firewall interworks with a user-defined portal server to authenticate users. So we also have authentication exemption for some of the internet access users. Users can be authenticated and access network resources without entering username and passwords. Authentication exception does not mean that users are not authenticated. In authentication exemption, users do not need to enter usernames and password, and the firewall can obtain information of identity via IP address to implement user-specific policy kind of management. We also have SMS authentication. The firewall authenticates users based on verification code, and the user obtains an SMS verification code via the SMS portal page provided by the firewall, enters the verification code, and after passing the authentication, then the firewall logs into the firewall as a temporary user. And then they can either be redirected or they can use user-initiated kind of access. With remote access, user authentication, the firewall authenticates VPN users during the connection. To authenticate the VPN access users before they access the network resources, you can configure some kind of secondary kind of authentication. And then lastly, the local authentication, where the server, local and server authentication. With local, the server does its authentication. So we have our scenario here, our diagram. I know it may not make a lot of sense to you, but basically these are some of the different ways. We have our internet users and we have our remote users. Our internet users and remote users, they can still use either local authentication or server authentication. Local if the firewall is going to perform the authentication. Server if they're going to use the Radius or the Huawei or Active Directory, depending on the server, which is going to perform the authentication on their behalf. So these are some of the things as to working with. It interworks with the Active Directory server, interworks with the Agile Controller server, Radius, depending on what you want to achieve. At the end of the day, they will see, are you authenticated? If you're not authenticated, they'll not give you permission to access the resources. If you're authenticated, then they will go ahead and give you permission to go ahead and access the resources. So let us look at single sign-on. We say that users can use Active Directory single sign-on to trigger authentication on the firewall. The firewall can have SSOs enabled to identify users that have been successfully authenticated by these authentication systems. In doing so, these users do not need to enter their usernames or password whenever accessing the network. The firewall supports multi-modes for obtaining the single sign-on authentication success messages during the Active Directory single sign-on. Single sign-on refers to that the firewall obtains user information from other authentication systems instead of authenticating users, so that users can go online from the firewall. And if users need to directly access network resources after being authenticated by Active Directory server, you can configure Active Directory single sign-on to trigger authentication. Active Directory single sign-on can be implemented in the following ways. You can either install a single sign-on service program to receive messages from PCs. You can also, 2, install single sign-on program to query the Active Directory server security logs, and 3, you can, the firewall monitors Active Directory authentication packets. So we have 3 modes, and it can be implemented in 3 modes. 1, install program to receive message from PCs. 2, install the single sign-on service program to query the Active Directory security logs. And 3, the firewall monitors Active Directory authentication packets. Please take note of that. Security logs, receives messages from PC, Active Directory authentication packets. So let us look at receiving messages from a PC. You need to deploy a single Active Directory sign-on Active Directory monitor. That will be the Active Directory domain controller or other devices in the Active Directory domain. Configure the login and logout scripts on the Active Directory server and set the Active Directory single sign-on parameters on the firewall to receive the user login and logout information from the Active Directory single sign-on. So you have the user who wants to access the internet. This user, once they send their details to your Active Directory server, or which can be the Active Directory domain controller, they will be processed with a login and logout script. And then you have an Active Directory monitor, and it can be any computer in the Active Directory domain, including the Active Directory controller. So the information will also come here at the same time, and then you to verify the user identity. Is it the password we have? If it's not the password we have, then either discard. If it's a password, the user information is now sent to our firewall, which will now authenticate the users to go ahead and access the information. So we have a querying message security logs from the Active Directory server. Here you need to deploy the single sign-on Active Directory monitor. It can be the domain controller or any other device in the Active Directory domain, and set the Active Directory single sign-on parameters on the firewall to receive the user login information and logout information from the Active Directory service. What is going to happen here? You have your user who is trying to access the internet. They're going to also query now the Active Directory, but now our Active Directory monitor is going to start the service, and it's going to at the same time look at the security logs and see if this user is permitted or not. And if it's permitted, it will send the information to the firewall, which will now give permission to the end user to go ahead and access the resources. The other one, which you go ahead and single sign-on with a firewall listening to Active Directory authentication packets. It's basically listening to the Active Directory authentication packets. In this mode, the program does not need to be installed on the Active Directory server. You don't install any program. The firewall just listens to the authentication packets sent by users who log into the Active Directory server to obtain authentication results. And if a user is authenticated, then the firewall adds the mapping between the user and the user's IP address or to the online user lists. So what is going to happen? You have your user who wants to access the internet. This user is going to send his requests to the domain, and then the domain server here, the firewall at the same time, it is listening to the mirrored data from the Active Directory server, just listening to see the domain, ever the server authenticates you or does not authenticate you, and depending on that data, then also your firewall will give you permission to access the resources by listening and monitoring to the authentication packets from the server. So now we have port authentication for internet users. In port authentication, many of you have heard of captive portal, what, those things. Whenever you're signing in, it takes you to the captive portal of your organization page asking you. For those who have used Rockspot, and whenever you visit Rockspot, it takes you to their page asking you for a voucher to put in so that you access their networks. So that is port authentication. So here the firewall or a third-party server provides port authentication page to authenticate users. You can trigger built-in port authentication using the following commands. You can either use redirected authentication. With redirected authentication, it implements authentication of internet users when they try to attempt or to access HTTP. When you have connected to Rockspot and you want to go to google.com and you put in google.com, but instead of loading google.com, your page is redirected to the captive portal or the authentication portal of the firewall, and says, please first enter username to access these resources. Also, we have user-initiated authentication. Here, the user-initiated authentication indicates that the internet access user proactively, even before they access the web pages for identity authentication, they do identity authentication before accessing network resources. They first go in their page, sign in before they even access the resources. So when it comes to built-in authentication mode redirected mode, here, when you are trying to access a page, you have a user, he's trying to access the HTTP servers, that's of google.com, and the user is going to be redirected to the authentication page by the firewall. Even before they actually go ahead and access it, they will punch in their username and password. Once they are authenticated, then the firewall will give them permission to access the internet after being authenticated. With the user initiated, even before they try and go to HTTP they first go to the login page, the authentication page from the server, and then the server will authenticate them. So they access a page, the server initiates internet access resources after being authenticated, and then the user can now finally go ahead and access those resources. With remote user with remote user authentication, here remote access users, authentication refers to authentication of various VPN access users. By VPN, we mean a virtual private network, and the authentication triggering mode is determined by the access mode. We can have SSL VPN, LTTP VPN, IPsec, PPO over Ethernet, and we are going to look at some of those details in the coming few chapters, so worry not. So some of the examples of VPN users, if they want to access, you have a user at your home, you're working from home, and you log into the device and submit the accounting passwords. And then after submitting, your firewall is going to check, firewall is going to verify the user accounts and passwords. And then account is going to access and give you permission to access the resources after authentication is successful. And then it's going to start accounting for the resources you're going to be using, and also the resources B is going to be using, and then allow you to access the different resources from your application server remotely. So the user authentication policies. Authentication policy, like you hear the word policy, authentication policies determine which data flows needs to undergo port authentication and authentication exemptions. I'm sorry, we have overshot by 15 minutes, but I want us to badly complete this, and we're about to come to the end of this. So the firewall does not authenticate passing by data flows by default, and authentication policies are required to filter data flows that require authentication. Authentication policies takes effect on the following authentication mode. We have redirected, we have user initiated, we have already talked about these things, we have single sign-on, and we have authentication exemption. We have talked about these things already, so I'm going to go ahead and skip some of those things. So with authentication policy, just explaining, basically an authentication policy is a set of authentication rules that determine whether to authenticate a data flow, and an authentication rule consists of conditions and an action. The condition used by a firewall to match the packets are as follows. You look at the source, where is it coming from? What is the intended destination? What is the source or destination address or region? And then you perform the rules basing on those authentication. So action indicates how firewalls process packets. Possible actions are as follow. When you receive the packet, you can take them to the port authentication. When you receive the packet, you can either exempt them from the authentication, or if you had configured no authentication, or after receiving the packet, now do an SMS authentication. And we looked at some of those things. So let us look at some of the configuration of the internet access users, and we're going to go through some of these things. But basically, you can configure a user or a user group. Before implementing a user or user group based management, you need to first create a user, of course. You have user A, user B, user C, and also a group where they're going to belong. You need to create those groups. And a user or a user group can be manually configured. You can even import it. It can be manually configured, or you can even import it from a server. And also for the authentication to occur when you're configuring the server, it can be a single sign-on server or a third-party server like the Radius or the Active Directory server, etc. So you can choose to manually configure. So you configure the server, configure the authentication domain, create a user group, and then the authentication process. So you can either choose to import locally those things, or you can even choose to import from your given server, and then you set the single sign-on parameters or set the global parameters, and then at the end of the day you go ahead and configure the authentication policy, whether it's an exemption or it's a portal authentication. The user will be required to sign in. So this is how you configure a Radius server. If you have a Radius server and you want to add it on your Huawei firewall, you go to your Huawei web GUI, you select object. After selecting object, select authentication server, go ahead and select Radius and click add to create a Radius server. When you click add, go ahead, give it a name, short key, fill in these details, and then you go ahead and generally you can Radius servers use port 812 for authentication and port 13 for accounting. So you can go ahead and set those details. You go through these slides, I will share them, so do not worry. So objects, choose objects if you're adding an Active Directory. choose authentication server and select Active Directory and click add to create the Active Directory server. Go through the same process and configure those things. Set the parameters based on the settings on your Active Directory. So you check and see your basic information about your Active Directory and also configure these settings here in your Huawei firewall. So creating users is also direct forward. You can have a user or a group of user. Basically select object here. After selecting object, go to users, and then under default users, you can go ahead and create here different. You can add, you can delete, you can modify an existing user, you can even copy, you can even export the lists here. When you open the web page, you should be in position to see some of those things. So configuring user attributes for existing users, you can click edit or modify. And when you click edit, like I've shown you here on edit or modify, when you click on edit or modify, then it will bring you details. Then you can go ahead and choose the different parameters of that user's expiration time, specific time. Go ahead and either allow this user to bind to the account information, depending, etc, etc. So configuring still your global authentication or communication, you can go to object, select user authentication option, select global or local, and perform the configurations as you will see in the slides which I'll share with you. And configuring the single sign-on still, select object, go to user, default, and then authentication mode and policy, and then you configure the single sign-on, and then set the internet access mode to single sign-on authentication. Make sure you check that and remove it from portal. And then Active Directory no plugin mode. If you want it to be no plugin mode, you go ahead and tick that. So you configure them according to what you want to achieve and depending on the requirement at hand. So I'll go ahead and share these slides and you'll be in position to go ahead. If you want to import users from another server, choose object, select user, and then you can go ahead and import. You can either import CSV files or DBM files from the local device. And with server importing, users from one authentication server in a batch, we first importing user or a group of information of authenticated users to the device users based on their server kind of priority. So online user management, you can also go ahead and manage the users who are online. You can even block them. You can either disconnect or you can choose to block a particular user at that given time. So this takes us to our last quiz and ask, which of the following items is not covered in AAA? Go ahead and say my check and tell us.
Management.
Mic check, management.
It is management because you have authentication, authorization, and accounting in AAA. Okay, you can now mute if you have. Okay, so which of the following modes are available for Active Directory single sign-on? I remember I talked about 3 of them. I even highlighted and I told you to take note.
Mic check, all of them except D, direct PC login. Receiving messages, it does.
Okay, very true. All of them, we said they can either receive messages from another PC on the Active Directory. We said you can even query logs from the Active Directory server. We said also by listening to the authentication packets from the Active Directory. So this one was not part of them. So this one makes it wrong, and this gives us our answer to be D. So that takes us to the summary. We have looked at user authentication overview, the AAA technologies, and the user authentication management and different application scenarios. And thank you for being part of this class. And that will be all.
Mic check.